Imagine living on a farm so isolated that your nearest neighbors are several minutes away. You're surrounded by fields, forests, and an awful lot of silence. You know your neighbors. They know you. Life is quiet, predictable, until one evening. You find footprints in the snow. They lead toward your house. But there are no footprints leading away. You check the property. Nothing. A few days later, you discover something else. Strange noises coming from the attic. Then a newspaper disappears. And eventually, someone notices that the door to an outbuilding appears to have been tampered with. If this were happening today, you'd probably install cameras immediately. In 1922 rural Bavaria, there weren't exactly many security systems available. There was just a family, a farm, and a growing feeling that someone was watching. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck. It belonged to Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's children Kazilia and Joseph, and Victoria's young daughter. They lived together on the isolated property outside the Bavarian village of Gruber. And according to later accounts, the family had already noticed something deeply unsettling. Someone had apparently been moving around the property at night. Andreas reportedly found footprints in fresh snow leading from the forest toward the farm. There were no matching tracks going back. He also reportedly found a newspaper on the property that he didn't recognize. And then there was the attic. Sounds. Movement. Something that made Andreas believe someone might actually be hiding inside his home. But no intruder was found. No one was arrested. And somehow, the family carried on living there. Which brings us to the question I can't stop thinking about. If you genuinely believe someone was hiding in your attic, why would you stay? We don't know exactly what Andreas believed. We don't even know whether every detail later reported about the strange events is completely accurate. But we do know this. By the end of March 1922, something terrible was about to happen at Hinterkaifeck. And whoever did it left behind one of Germany's most enduring unsolved murder mysteries. By the end of March 1922, the strange things at Hinterkaifeck hadn't stopped. But the family had something else to worry about. Victoria Gabriel, Andreas Gruber's daughter, was expected to attend church in the nearby village. She didn't. And the family didn't appear at church that weekend either. At first, perhaps nobody thought much of it. Rural life could be unpredictable. But then Monday came, and the children didn't appear at school. That was unusual. Then the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, didn't arrive at work. Maria had only just taken the job. She had arrived at Hinterkaifeck on March 31st, 1922. She was reportedly the first new maid the family had employed after the previous one left because she believed the farm was haunted. Yes, haunted. At this point, even the farm's backstory was beginning to sound like it had been written specifically to make us uncomfortable. But the real problem wasn't the rumors. It was the silence. No one from the family had been seen for several days. Finally, on April 4th, neighbors became concerned. A local man, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, went to the farm with two others to investigate. What they found was horrifying. Several members of the family were discovered dead inside the barn. Others were found inside the farmhouse. All 6 victims had been killed. They were Andreas Gruber, Kazilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, 7-year-old Kazilia Gabriel, 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel, and the newly hired maid, Maria Baumgartner. The crime scene immediately raised questions. There had been no obvious sign of a frantic struggle throughout the entire property. And even stranger, investigators began to suspect that the killer may have known the farm well. But then came the detail that turned a terrible murder into one of Germany's most infamous mysteries. Evidence suggested that someone may have remained at Hinterkaifeck after the killings. Animals had apparently been fed. And there were other indications that the farm had not simply been abandoned immediately after the murders. Think about that for a moment. 6 people were dead. And yet, the farm didn't immediately become silent. Someone may have been there, moving around, feeding the livestock, going about their business, while the outside world had no idea what had happened. The police now had a horrifying question to answer. Who killed the family, and why did they stay? And perhaps even more disturbing, was the killer already watching them before the murders? When the police arrived at Hinterkaifeck, they weren't walking into a simple murder scene. They were walking into a puzzle. 6 people were dead. The family had apparently been killed over the course of the night of March 31st into April 1st, 1922. But who had done it? And why? Investigators began examining the farm carefully. The murder weapon was eventually identified as a farm tool called a mattock, which was found on the property. That created an immediate problem. If the killer had used something from the farm, then the weapon didn't necessarily tell them who the killer was. It could have been someone who knew the property. It could have been someone who simply found the tool there. And then investigators encountered one of the most discussed details of the entire case. The family's livestock had apparently been cared for after the killings. Feed had been given to the animals. There were also indications that bread had been eaten and that someone had spent time inside the farmhouse. But here's where we need to be careful. Later retellings sometimes turn these clues into the killer lived in the attic for days. That makes for a fantastic horror story. But historians cannot establish that as fact. What we can say is that there were unusual indications that the farm remained active after the murders, which raises an extraordinary possibility. The killer may not have immediately fled. Then investigators started looking at the family themselves. And there was plenty to investigate. The Grubers had difficult relationships with some people in their community. There were disputes. There were rumors. There were suspicions surrounding members of the family. And Victoria Gabriel had a complicated personal life. She had been married, but her husband was missing after serving in the First World War and was officially presumed dead. She also had a young son, Joseph, whose paternity became a subject of speculation. One man in particular attracted attention: Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He had previously been involved with Victoria. He was also believed to have had a dispute concerning Joseph's paternity. And, importantly, he was one of the men who discovered the bodies. That combination made him an obvious person for investigators to question. But being suspicious isn't the same thing as being guilty. Schlittenbauer was investigated, and theories about his involvement have persisted for generations. Yet no conclusive evidence ever established that he was the killer. And that became the problem with Hinterkaifeck. Almost every promising clue seemed to lead somewhere. And then stop. There were strange footprints. A family already frightened by an unknown presence. A weapon from the farm. A possible motive. And someone who may have remained on the property afterward. But there was no confession. No definitive eyewitness. No reliable forensic technology to reconstruct what happened. And no suspect the authorities could prove had committed the murders. The investigation widened. Names were written down. People were questioned. Theories multiplied. But the killer remained free. And eventually, the case went cold. But it never really disappeared. Because decades later, investigators would still return to Hinterkaifeck, trying to answer the same question. Who was watching that farm before the murders? With 6 people dead, investigators had to start somewhere. And Hinterkaifeck had no shortage of people to look at. There were family tensions. There were personal relationships. There were old accusations. And there were people who had reasons to dislike members of the Gruber and Gabriel families. But a motive is not a murder conviction. And that distinction matters enormously in this case. One of the first people to attract serious attention was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He had previously been romantically involved with Victoria Gabriel. Their relationship had ended badly, and there had been a dispute concerning Victoria's young son, Joseph. Schlittenbauer was also one of the men who discovered the victims. So naturally, investigators wanted answers. And his behavior at the farm became the subject of enormous speculation. But speculation isn't evidence. No surviving investigation established that Schlittenbauer committed the murders. And he was never convicted of them. Then there was another uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the killer had been a stranger. Someone passing through the area. Someone who had learned enough about the family to know when they would be vulnerable. Remember those footprints? The mysterious newspaper? The reports of noises in the attic? If those details were accurately reported, they suggest something important. Whoever was responsible may have been near the farm before the murders. But even that isn't certain. Some of the most famous details of Hinterkaifeck were recorded or repeated after the event, and over the years, retellings have made the story increasingly dramatic. That's one of the problems with old crimes. Every generation adds a little more certainty to things that were never certain in the first place. The police investigated numerous possibilities. Suspects came and went. Stories were compared. Motives were examined. But nobody could produce the one thing investigators desperately needed: proof. And then time began working against them. The case remained unsolved. The farm itself was eventually demolished. The people who had lived there disappeared into history. But the questions didn't. Who had been watching the family? Why were they killed? Why were some of the family's belongings apparently left undisturbed? And perhaps the biggest question of all, was the killer someone the family already knew? More than a century later, we still don't have a definitive answer. But Hinterkaifeck left something behind. Not a confession. Not a name. A mystery. And sometimes, unfortunately, history gives us exactly that. I am Sade, and this has been History with Sade. I'll see you in the next story.